Hello everyone, my name is Joanna and I'm assistant professor at the University of Warwick in the UK. I'm delighted to be here at Research with International Students to share a systematic literature review I conducted with colleagues from the European Network on International Student Mobility. Our review is about the impact of COVID-19 on social inequalities among international students. And as I mentioned, it was developed by a group of 10 researchers and one practitioner, all of us part of working group number 2, which is about social inequality. Our work has already been published with comparative migration studies, so if you are interested in it, please feel free to scan the QR code on the top right of my screen and download the paper, which is open. So the question I'll be addressing in today's video is, what social inequalities did the COVID pandemic reveal among international students? Were these challenges entirely new, or did the pandemic simply shine a light on issues that were already there? To address this question, I will try to be as brief as possible, partly for your attention span and partly because I think YouTube doesn't like videos that turn into mini documentaries. So I'll just very briefly touch on the methods part to give me more time to dive into the findings. So the video will be structured in 4 parts. In the first part, I will tell you why and how we conducted the review. In the second part, I will explain what the 48 eligible studies tell us about the field of international student mobility, to then be finally able to unpack how COVID shaped inequalities at 3 levels: the micro or student level, the meso or institutional level, meaning the higher education institution, and the macro governmental level. I will finish off with the main takeaways of our review. So the very first question we asked ourselves at the start of this review was, why do we actually need to systematize knowledge on the impact of COVID? We identified 4 reasons. The first one is disciplinary fragmentation. Research on student mobility comes from multiple fields, each with its own favorite variable of interest and its own favorite methods. And unfortunately, this creates gaps, especially around social inequalities, where insights often fall between disciplinary cracks. This lack of systematization, in turn, leads to terminological inconsistency. As we know, researchers often talk about the same thing using different search terms, and this makes it really difficult to aggregate studies on the same topic. As for the third reason, this refers to basically the limited applicability of the pre-pandemic literature to the post-pandemic world. Much of the pre-pandemic literature focuses on equity of access, on the assumption that the more privileged students are more likely to go abroad. As a result, the pre-pandemic literature essentially focused on the pre-departure phase, not necessarily taking into account the lived experience of international students while abroad. Finally, even if it's the more privileged students who go abroad, their economic capital doesn't shield them from experiencing other inequalities related to race, gender, legal status, or other intersecting forms of disadvantage. Because of this, in our review, we aim to identify inequalities at the intersection of different phases of study abroad and different levels of analysis. Our guiding question for the review was, what impact did the pandemic have on social inequalities in physical international student mobility since COVID-19 was declared a public health emergency of international concern by the World Health Organization in January 2020? We derived our search terms from our search question, and we conducted a scoping review, meaning that we were more interested in breadth rather than depth, to map out all existing studies on our topic of interest. We applied 3 inclusion criteria, so we only included studies that explicitly addressed social inequality issues. We also only included those studies explicitly addressing international students in higher education context, meaning that we excluded other education levels. And because we were interested in the evidence-based impact of COVID, we only included empirical papers that were published between January 2020 and June 2022. We conducted our searches across 7 electronic databases and 11, and we also conducted end searches across 11 journals, on international higher education matters, student mobility, as well as migration studies. We started with 92 studies, but not all of them met our eligibility criteria, and because of that, we ended with 48 studies. We extracted data from all 48 studies using the 16 categories of analysis that you now see on screen. The first 13 helped us map the field of international student mobility, covering publication details, theoretical and methodological approaches, types of mobility, countries of origin and destination, and whether students were sampled at home or abroad. And here I'm referring to category number 7. The final 3 categories, highlighted in brown at the bottom right of my screen, they address the dimensions of social inequality that we identified in the papers, tracking the moment when they occurred. So when they occurred during the study abroad cycle, so before, during, and after, as well as who they affected or what triggered them. And here I'm referring to a different level of analysis. Together, category 14, 15, and 16 allowed us to basically develop our matrix on social inequalities that you are going to see next. Well, not next, because first I will explain basically how our studies characterize the field of international student mobility, so category 4 to 7, to then be able to unpack the social inequality matrix, so category 14 and 16, as I've already said. So let's then start with the types of international student mobility our studies focused on. So the majority of our studies examine degree-seeking students pursuing a full degree abroad. Only a small number looked at exchange students who studied abroad temporarily for credit recognition. Most studies focused on incoming students, meaning that they sampled students in their host country. The top sending countries, or countries of origin of the students, perhaps come as no surprise to you, as they are known for being major net exporter of students. And so most of our studies focus on students from China, including Hong Kong and Macau, followed by India, Pakistan, and Kazakhstan. As for the category multiple countries that you also see on screen, perhaps you are wondering what does it mean? And this category essentially refers to studies that looked at students from more than 3 countries or broader regions like Asia or the Global South. The top receiving countries are major education hubs in the Anglophone world, so the USA, Australia, and the UK. So now that we know who the students are, where they come from, and where did they go, let's then unpack the matrix. So what you see at the center are the dimensions of social inequalities. In the rows, we have the different levels of analysis. So who these inequalities targeted or what triggered them. The columns represent the moment when the inequalities occurred across the study abroad cycle, so before, during, or after the mobility experience. Another thing that I should also point out is, whereas some dimensions of inequality are specific to a study abroad phase, so for example, financial vulnerability here occurs during the in-country phase, whereas other dimensions like determinants of study abroad plans can cut across the entire study abroad cycle. So speaking of determinants of study abroad plans, here I should mention that, for example, in the before phase, this category refers to prospective international students who postponed their plans due to COVID, whereas in the after phase, it refers to students who had studied abroad during COVID and because of that changed their future overseas plans. In today's video, I'll focus on the most common dimensions of inequality that emerged essentially while students were in the host country. So let me highlight them. Okay, you can already see them on screen. Let's then start with the most frequently reported form of social inequality, which is mental health. So this category gathered a total of 14 studies. And perhaps the category itself is quite straightforward because, as we know, international students can suffer from psychological stress, and usually they do suffer from more psychological stress than their domestic peers. And this is particularly true. This was particularly true during COVID. And it happened for many reasons, due to the limited resources of international students, their weaker social support networks, or also it might be related to barriers linked to their foreign-born status. So, for example, some students couldn't access national support systems, while other students, and especially Chinese students, experienced distress from xenophobic assumptions that they were carriers of the virus. The second most common dimension of inequality was experiences of exclusion. Exclusion actually took many forms, often linked to discriminatory behavior, as I have just explained, which in turn worsened the mental health of international students. And actually, as you will see in a second, these two dimensions intersected very, very often. Also, some students were excluded because of their financial vulnerability. They had to rely on precarious jobs, or they lost their scholarship when online learning didn't meet eligibility criteria, forcing them to change their study abroad plans. For other students, exclusion meant poor psychosocial adjustment, especially because, as we know, lockdowns limited their interaction with host communities, and online provision essentially reduced opportunities for language learning and, as an implication, their cultural integration. So, as I mentioned before, dimensions of social inequality don't exist in isolation. They intersect in complex ways, and this Venn diagram illustrates that, because it essentially captures how different forms of inequality, like mental health, exclusion, determinants of study abroad, and financial vulnerability overlap and reinforce one another. So, as I also mentioned before, COVID-19 disrupted study abroad plans for both prospective students and those already studying abroad. Many students deferred their plans, while others reconsider future mobility opportunities altogether. But overall, I would say that studies show that the likelihood of studying abroad decreased during the pandemic. This shift was driven by a range of factors: personal or family concerns, health and safety risks, diplomatic tensions between home and host countries, fears of the anti-China sentiment abroad, especially for Chinese students, of course, and uncertainty about returning home during travel restrictions. Another key theme is financial vulnerability. And financial vulnerability, or the financial vulnerability of our students, the reasons for this economic precarity varied, as you will see. So some students had to rely on precarious jobs to survive, while others faced limited access to welfare due to their foreign-born status. Broader geopolitical and economic asymmetries also played a role, as well as students' economic capital. So students from low-income countries and working-class backgrounds, they were hit the hardest, because essentially the pandemic intensified their pre-existing financial precarity. For many students, travel restrictions added a further strain, increasing costs and uncertainty around mobility. As for the meso level, institutional support services was the most frequent category, and institutional support services refer essentially to how well universities responded to the challenges faced by international students during the pandemic by providing them appropriate support structures. So these studies essentially, or the studies that fell under this category, assessed the adequacy and student satisfaction with a range of institutional support mechanisms, including financial aid, hygiene and social distancing measure, effective communication, well-being and mental health support, remote teaching, pastoral care services, and quarantine support. So together, these services also shaped how students coped with the disruptions of the pandemic. Finally, at the macro level, studies examined governmental policies and public perceptions in light of COVID. Most studies in this category highlighted how national responses affect international students' lived experiences by limiting mobility opportunities, restricting their rights during their foreign-born status, as well as disrupting transnational support networks or blocking access to societal services. Crucially, international students' perspectives were often overlooked, as unfortunately governments prioritize national interests and forgot about international students' needs. Public narratives also played a role. Some tweets and media portrayals fueled with racism framed international students, particularly those from China's virus spreaders. Well, to finish off, I would like to highlight the main three takeaways from our review. Well, first, the COVID literature reminded us of the importance of paying attention to the lived experience of international students in the host countries. Second, we must also examine how higher education institutions and governments may contribute to or even exacerbate these inequalities. And the studies we assembled start looking at that, but more needs to be done. Third, inequalities are multifaceted and intersecting. They don't fit into neat categories, and their complexity demands nuanced analysis. And finally, perhaps the most powerful lesson from the COVID literature is that international students are not simply a mobile elite. They can also be a deeply vulnerable group, deserving care, protection, and policy attention. Well, and I think that's all on my side. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email at joanna.almeida@warwick.ac.uk. Perhaps you are wondering about the references used in this video. They are listed here, but you won't see all. But please do download our papers. All the references that I used are listed in the paper. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you in the next video. Bye.